Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
I'm with Vijay Gokhale, former Foreign Secretary of India, former Ambassador to China, speaks, writes, reads Chinese and Sanskrit, mind you. And if this book is any proof, the long game, how the Chinese negotiate with India. Vijay, you have a copy of your book. Would you like to hold it up? Thank. And if this book is any proof, Mr. Gokhale perhaps thinks and dreams in Chinese as well. Mr. Gokhale, welcome to The Print.
Thank you, Jyoti. Thank you for having me on your show.
Now, your book is, some retired diplomats join, multinational companies and make hefty sums in fees. You write books on China, and this particular book has 6 very interesting chapters, 6 critical pieces of negotiation, if you like. You start with Tibet. So I'm wondering if I could ask you to talk a little bit about the India-Tibet story, and if you could contextualize it also in terms of contemporary happenings.
Jyoti, thank you for having me on the show again. Before I talk about that, may I just inform your listeners about my book in general?
Yeah.
I wanted to write a book that was easy to read for a curious Indian.
It is very easy to read.
So I wasn't writing either for an international audience or for the academics and scholars, because they already have enough information on China.
Right.
The objective was to introduce anybody else in India who was curious to know about China, about how it conducts its diplomacy, how it does negotiations, and how we handle it. So that was really the objective. Now,
if I may intervene, for example, Mao Zedong being the chief guest at India's Republic Day in 1951, and only 11 years later, India and China fight this very bitter conflict.
Your first question, therefore, is relevant, because we must remember that in 1947, when we gained independence from the British, there was, of course, a class of civil servants who existed, known as the Indian Civil Service, but they had almost no diplomatic experience. The experience was principally administering law and order in India. And the new political leadership, barring Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, who had been educated abroad, was almost entirely educated in India and not exposed to foreign influence. So to some extent, the Republic of India began with a certain disadvantage, and that disadvantage was lack of diplomatic experience. Now, added to that, of course, was the fact that we had an adversary who had diplomatic experience. Right. Not only because the Chinese empire was never extinguished in the way that independent India had been extinguished by the British. And therefore, the Chinese empire had a legacy of diplomatic experience which continued all the way down to 1949.
Okay.
But also because the new rulers of China, Mao, Zhou Enlai and others, had some amount of diplomatic experience in dealing with the United States, with the Soviet Union, with Japan and so on. And therefore some amount of experience in negotiation, because it would be well to remember that in fact the United States had tried to broker a deal between the communists and Chiang Kai-shek immediately after the end of the Second World War.
Right.
So in a sense, the whole issue of Tibet hinged upon the relative absence of experience on our side and a much more experienced Chinese side. But that, in my book, is only part of the story.
Yeah.
The other part of the story is that we adopted very early on a blinkered approach. Now, to some extent, this was self-imposed, because we had an embassy in China even before the communists took over. And we took a strategic decision to retain that embassy in China, even after the Chiang Kai-shek government collapsed and before the People's Republic of China was formally established.
Right.
In a sense, therefore, we had a channel to the Chinese communists, and we did not use that diplomatic channel to get the facts.
But why?
Well, I think partly the policy was influenced by a sense in the government of India. And that sense essentially came from the direction of the Prime Minister, who was also the External Affairs Minister.
Nehru.
That, yes, Prime Minister Nehru, that in overall terms, our principal objective was to develop a friendship with China because India and China would be the two emerging powers to shape a post-World War Asia.
But the Chinese never saw it that way.
The Chinese never saw it that way. And what surprised me when I was doing research for this book, Jyoti, was that the Chinese had made public statements about Tibet. So these were not just inner party secret documents, but public pronouncements that they intended to take back Tibet or to bring Tibet back to the fold of the Chinese people, is the way they put it.
Right.
So in a sense, we missed some important signs both before our independence and immediately after our independence. And it led, therefore, to a negotiation which was entirely one-sided. And as I point out in my book, the Chinese bloodlessly achieved their objective. So the story of this is what I narrate in the first and second chapters. And I think this is something the Indian reader will find interesting because, as I explained, I wrote it in a way which would make it an interesting read.
So how would you describe this story? I mean, is it a tragic story? It's would you say that Nehru's blinkered approach? Would you describe it as a blinkered approach? Was it wishful thinking? You know, sort of this romantic view of China.
Well, I think all those phrases apply. Wishful thinking, romantic view of China, and blinkered approach. But of course, with the privilege of hindsight, it is always easy to criticize.
Exactly.
So that's why I started out by saying that there was a certain amount of diplomatic inexperience on our side. And sometimes it takes a while to build out your diplomatic system or structure. And perhaps these were early days. However, a chapter that I did not have in my book, but which has been written about by many others, which is, of course, the debacle of 1962, is something which, of course, by then, of course, we could hardly claim that we did not have diplomatic experience. So, in a sense, what happened in Tibet in the early 50s, leading to the agreement of 54, was a precursor of things to come. And in a sense, we didn't make up for the lack of diplomatic experience. And I think therein lies the tragedy.
Mm-hmm. So how would you end your chapter in 1954 with this trade agreement between India and China, where India concludes or accepts that Tibet is a region of China, and you use that word region of China. Of course, you don't come all the way up to 1959 when the Dalai Lama flees Tibet and comes to India. But talk to us a little bit about the story of the Dalai Lama.
Well, this is a story that was written in those early years of Indian independence when His Holiness the Dalai Lama came to India, not once but twice. He came in 1956. And that time too, he indicated his wish to stay on in India, but subsequently returned. And he came back in 1959, presumably again for a temporary stay, but he has stayed for 6 decades. So in a sense, I think Tibet is the central point in India-China relations. It was the central point that led perhaps to the boundary conflict in 1962. And so far as China is concerned, it continues to remain a sore point. And I point to the speech given by General Secretary Xi Jinping on the 1st of July, in which he says that if anybody tries to interfere with China's sovereignty and territorial integrity, then they will be hitting their heads against the Great Wall of 1.4 billion. Mm-hmm. Tibet, of course, is integral to that narrative. So I think that there is a centrality to this, and therefore the chapter in the book is important. I do want to mention, however, Jyoti, that the objective of writing this book was not to do a history of India-China relations, but to show how the Chinese negotiate with us.
Right.
What tactics they use, what strategy they use, how they formulate an objective. So in that sense, the story of Tibet was one of negotiation between India and China. And that's really the central point of the book.
And this story of negotiation between India and China on Tibet, you describe it as salami slicing. so Zhou Enlai or the other leaders. And Deng Xiaoping, actually, you say, is the one who's in charge of bringing Tibet around in 1950 when the Chinese take over. Now, describe to us a little bit of this salami slicing and why repeatedly does Nehru fall for it?
Well, Jyoti, I hope people will read the book because they get the full flavor of.
We are enticing them to read it now.
The way in which Chinese proceeded. But I will say this in brief, that they had a clear objective. And the strategy was essentially designed to achieve that objective. Now, given the fact that they were not in physical control of the territory, the first part of the strategy required them to therefore befriend India, at least on the surface. Once they had got physical control of the territory, then the question came of dealing with India. So what I show in the book really is how the Chinese devised strategy and tactics based on objectives, and more importantly, adjusted that strategy and tactics based upon Indian responses. Now, in contrast, I also show how the Indian strategy and tactics were almost frozen in time. That there was no real attempt to change course or to revise course, because what we had assumed had not really played out. And therefore, it was almost, in a sense, the government of India deluding itself because it really wanted to justify that its original strategy was correct, and therefore there was no course correction. So I think in the first two chapters of the book, I try to show how in the early years after independence, a whole series of issues, a lack of diplomatic experience, the absence of a proper diplomatic consultation within the government of India and so on, led to a situation which should not have happened. Whereas on the Chinese side, both their diplomatic experience and subsequently their preparation for the negotiations allowed them to achieve all their objectives. And again, I use the word bloodlessly.
Right. So now this course correction that you talk about, and some of it you say in another chapter when India went nuclear in 1998, and you describe that also very beautifully. I mean, it's masterfully written, that chapter. But I'm just wondering if we can fast forward to 2021 and if you can contextualize for us this conjunction between India, Tibet, and China. Why are the Chinese across the line of control, line of actual control, in Ladakh? So just explain to me, to our viewers, why are the Chinese wanting to cross the LAC and occupy territory in Ladakh?
Jyoti, that's a subject which I have been careful not to express my views on, simply because it's too sensitive a matter. So I won't directly address that issue. But what I will say is that we have gained maturity in our dealing with the Chinese in terms of understanding their approach and in terms of negotiating with them.
What is that approach?
Yeah, so it's anybody's guess as to why they did this. I think there is a lot of speculation in the Indian media and in the strategic community, but we don't have any hard evidence of it. But I think the approach now is essentially of holding firm and of preparing to deal with the emergent situation rather than holding to a strategy that might have been there earlier and simply not adjusting to the new reality. So if you look at it, what they did in March, April and May of 2020, which was that they violated several fundamental agreements that the two countries had arrived at voluntarily in the 1990s and the 2000s, the government of India this time responded, they reacted. And in a sense, we were able to claw back our position and to reiterate the basic principle that either both sides respect previous agreements or we are prepared to respond to any provocation. And I think that in a sense was done diplomatically because there was no military clash aside from the very tragic incident in Galwan on the 14th of June. Yeah. There was no military clash. So in a sense, this was a diplomatic response or a diplomatic military response, if you wish. And I think it showed the government of India's the way, how far we had come from the 1950s in handling this issue. But again, this is not a subject I deal with in my book. In fact, I do want to clarify to your viewers that I did not deal with the India-China boundary at all in this book.
Right.
For two reasons. One, because it's very widely written about in any case. And secondly, because I think it's still an ongoing negotiation, and therefore, given my previous position in the government, I didn't think it appropriate to express my views this early on.
Right. So, but explain to me, the Dalai Lama is 86, we know. Does his presence in India today, although he's an old man, does it have to do with the Chinese view of India, even today?
I think it does, because after 50 or 60 years away from Tibet, the Tibetans still regard the Dalai Lama as their spiritual leader. Mm-hmm. So I presume that his presence in India is something that remains of concern to the Chinese side.
And this is something that Nehru did not foresee, or was not willing to foresee, that the Dalai Lama was, I hate to call it him or his position a negotiating tactic, but Nehru failed to see that.
Well, I think in hindsight it's easy to say that, but in the 1950s things were not clear. I guess we didn't have the benefit of hindsight, which is 1962 and all that happened since then. I think we have to make allowances for that, but notwithstanding that fact, my book really brings out that there were sufficient indications from the Chinese side about concerns, about a number of their concerns, including in the entire process leading to the entry of the People's Liberation Army into Tibet in October 1950, and subsequently right up to the talks of 1954. Perhaps we missed those signs, perhaps we ignored those signs. And of course, the consequences are with us today.
So could India today use the Dalai Lama to course correct its own policy on China?
I can't speak to that, Jyoti, because that would be speculative, frankly.
All right. Now, I'd like to come to another chapter in your book, which was the Indo-US nuclear agreement, the 123 agreement. And you talk about how in the wake of India's nuclear tests, China first came down very heavily and was willing to use or willing to walk with the Americans in sanctioning India. And you use this very beautiful phrase, which is murder with a borrowed knife. I don't know the Chinese equivalent of it. But can you talk about how first the Chinese and the Americans came together and then fell apart? That relationship fell apart when the Indo-US nuclear deal was signed.
Well, in a nutshell, Jyoti, this chapter is about how Chinese diplomacy has evolved after the Deng Xiaoping period. Mm-hmm. When China became much more confident of its position on the international stage and much more cognizant of the fact that being a permanent member of the Security Council and being an acknowledged nuclear weapons state gave it a global status. Now, a corollary of this, at least to my understanding, was that they treated India as not as an equal. Mm-hmm. And the real story of this chapter, both of the chapter relating to the nuclear tests and the chapter relating to the 123 deal, is essentially the approach of the Chinese side of dealing with India from a position of superiority and from a perceived position of strength. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, by now, India had 50 years of diplomatic experience, not only in dealing with the Chinese, but navigating the very difficult period of the Cold War, where we had to navigate between the United States and the Soviet Union without appearing to be obviously aligned to either. And therefore, I think to some extent, this diplomatic experience was brought to bear, to my mind, very successfully, in neutralizing efforts by the Chinese to negotiate or talk down to us. So I think the real message of this chapter is that you don't have to be economically or militarily equal to deal with the Chinese. But what you have to be is adept at using whatever capabilities you have and to leverage them to convey a message to the Chinese side that you intend to hold fast to your interests. So I think this is the sense I hope readers will get from this chapter.
And weaker
Now, of
nations,
course,
yeah, and I'm just wondering, weaker nations like India can ally with stronger powers like the US to deal with the Chinese. Would that be another lesson?
I think that would be an important lesson, but the other side also would be that we should not be discouraged if China tries to leverage its global status to build a coalition against us, because there are certain attractive elements in India, including our system of values, our democracy, our economy, our market potential, our human resources, and so on, which can be leveraged to ensure that the Chinese are not able to build a strong alliance of the major powers against India. Remember that in 1998, I think perhaps we all believe that Prime Minister Vajpayee and his government's greatest contribution to Indian foreign policy were the nuclear tests of 1998 per se.
Yeah.
But I believe that equally important was Prime Minister Vajpayee's government's capability to stand up to the subsequent economic sanctions, because in doing that, we proved to the government proved to the people of India that even when 5 permanent members of the Security Council stand together to sanction you, you have the capability economically and diplomatically to stand firm and eventually to break those sanctions. So I think that was a contribution which I hopefully also brought out in my chapter.
Right. Now, you mentioned that China believes that it is superior to India, doesn't believe that India is an equal. Would you say that the current conflict in Ladakh is really another manifestation of that? And this is how it's playing itself out, is that how dare India stand up to China?
I would certainly hazard the guess that the Chinese side tries to play the game of superior and inferior. But I think the Indian side doesn't want to play that game anymore. And if there was anything we demonstrated in Eastern Ladakh, it was that we were not going to play that game.
So isn't it a gesture of weakness that you would aggressively, cross another person's, territorial boundary, even though you may not agree with it legally? But what are you trying to do? You're trying to say that this is a fellow Asian power, and I'm trying to subjugate you. So you better stay in your own little corner.
I think we've seen over the last 2 years, Jyoti, that intimidation is a weapon in the Chinese diplomatic arsenal, whether it is with Philippines on the South China Sea, whether it is with Australia on the trade embargo, whether it is with South Korea over the deployment of the theater high altitude defense system that the United States placed. So in that sense, I don't think what the Chinese are doing with us is unique. And I do think that we recognize what the Chinese are doing. And I believe India is playing the game and playing it fairly well.
Why would they want to intimidate fellow nations, even if those nations are economically weaker than you? Why would you want to bully somebody else?
I suppose it is because China wants to enforce the view that they are the dominant Asian power, because they are now looking at becoming the dominant global power. And any potential competitors are therefore to be scared away, I suspect. Now, of course, that's a flawed strategy in my opinion, but I can't speak for the Chinese.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the lessons for India from, you have a full chapter dedicated to lessons for India in your book. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, the lessons for India are not so much for India as for those who are negotiating. The effort of that chapter is essentially to see if we could find certain common strands in the way the Chinese negotiate with us, which will hopefully not only be useful to the government side, but equally to the business side. Because ultimately some of these principles are part of the cultural and environmental conditioning of the Chinese people, in the same way that the Indian people are also environmentally and culturally conditioned to
so give us three lessons that India or the Indians should learn or can learn, not just negotiators.
No, well, I think first of all, the lesson number one is to prepare. I think preparation is at the heart of the way the Chinese negotiate with us, and we should be very well prepared before we enter into a negotiation.
Okay.
The second is we have to presume that the Chinese negotiate to deceive. And therefore, accepting anything at face value, unless it is in a written form, and duly signed by both governments, would, in my mind, be extremely dangerous.
The trust
And I think
verify.
well, more than trust but verify. I think trust but verify in a written form, not trust and not. I don't think we should accept an oral assurance and then try and trust and verify. It must be in writing. And the third point, I think, is that there are certain vulnerabilities in the Chinese negotiating position. This is not simply, we don't have to see them as a 10-foot giant we are dealing with. Yes, they are more powerful than us. They have a greater economy than us. They have a bigger military than us. But there are vulnerabilities in the negotiation. I'm not talking militarily, now I'm talking diplomatically. And we need to also build on those vulnerabilities.
So identify the vulnerabilities of the other side and then...
Well, I think that should be something your readers, your listeners should read. Because I think that chapter is something which I am quite proud of having written, because I haven't seen any Indian author write about the sort of mechanics of negotiating with the Chinese. Right. There are a number of excellent books in the West on this, but I think that, negotiating from the American perspective is very different from negotiating from the Indian perspective.
What's the difference?
Oh, they're a bigger power. The Chinese, all countries, and China is no exception, deals with the opposite side after weighing its capabilities, its capacities, its power, its national strength, and so on. So we should not adopt the same negotiating tactics as the Americans, simply because the Americans are much bigger than us. And that's why I wrote that chapter, because I feel we have to look at it from an Indian perspective.
Right. Now, I'm almost out of time, but I do want to ask you this one last question, which is that, and I think you were Foreign Secretary at the time, in the 60th anniversary of the Dalai Lama's entry into India in 2018. And I think the government of India cancelled a lot of the events or celebrations that were supposed to commemorate that arrival into India. Why did that happen?
Jyoti, I'm not in government anymore. I cannot answer that question. You have to pose that to the...
But you were in government at the time.
True, but I'm not in government now. So I think it would not be appropriate for me to comment.
Would you say in hindsight that those celebrations should have been allowed to continue? Because if you're talking about the Dalai Lama as a negotiating tactic, then perhaps you have to put him up front.
Well, Jyoti, you might well say that, but I cannot possibly comment.
It's just that, for example, Prime Minister Modi has now said that he called His Holiness on his birthday and he intends to meet him. So, so my question, what do you think of that?
I have read his tweet.
Okay. Spoken like a true former Foreign Secretary, Mr. Vijay Gokhale. Thank you so much for speaking to the print. And let me just hold up the book again, and viewers, do go out and buy it. Mr. Gokhale, as you know, is still reticent about speaking about the recent past, but this book is well worth every rupee that you spend on it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jyoti. Thank you very much.